The forest lay under a wide sky, and yet it felt strangely closed in. The air was thick, carrying the smell of damp earth and leaves that had fallen long ago. Sunlight touched the treetops, but beneath the canopy it was dim, like the forest wanted, to keep its secrets hidden. Anyone who walked into it would notice something first with their ears before their eyes: the silence. Not the gentle, peaceful silence of a calm day, but a silence heavy and tense, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Predators lived here, creatures known for their noise and strength. Their cubs normally filled the woods with rough play, snapping twigs, growling at each other, testing tiny claws against bark or stone. But on this day, they were different. Their games had ended early, replaced by a kind of watchfulness. The cubs crouched low, eyes darting between the trees. Their older kin, usually bold and loud, stayed still in the shadows. Not a single growl echoed, not even a distant cry. To anyone who understood the ways of animals, this was a clear warning. Something unusual had come. The forest had always been alive with sound. Birds sang high in the branches. Insects hummed in swarms. Small creatures rustled the ground cover. Together they created a rhythm, the heartbeat of wild land. Yet today, even that heartbeat seemed to skip. The birds had flown to higher ridges, leaving the branches bare. The insects had fallen quiet, hiding deep in the soil. The very air seemed to press downward, heavy with expectation. It was the kind of silence that could make even the bravest predator hesitate. Observers who studied the ridge from a distance noticed the change quickly. They had seen seasons turn, storms come and go, and animals move through their cycles. But silence of this kind was rare. They leaned closer through their scopes, making notes and exchanging quiet glances. Something was causing this calm, but not the calm of safety, the calm of warning, the kind that came before something arrived. Deep in the forest, a set of footprints appeared in the soft soil. They did not belong to any beast of this land. The stride was even, measured, carrying neither panic nor hurry. A weight pressed into the ground with each step, not heavy like a predator's pounce, but steady like a drum beat. The cubs sniffed at the air, their ears twitching. They did not know what to make of the scent, but their instincts made them retreat further into the brush. It was then that the silence deepened, like the forest itself bent its head to watch. The creatures of claw and fang sensed what was approaching, long before it was visible. They didn't understand the shape, nor the reason, only that something about it didn't belong here. The quiet pressed harder, as though the trees themselves leaned closer, their branches barely moving in the still air. The ridge stood like a guardian over the forest, its rocks sharp and uneven, carved by time and weather. Normally, the predators used it as their stage, roaring from its ledges, showing their strength to the world below. But that day, no sound came. The ridge was still, as if the land itself refused to disturb what was unfolding. The cubs pawed, nervously at the ground, but made no cry. Their elders stood behind them, tense yet cautious, waiting. The human figure appeared slowly, not charging or forcing a path, but simply walking forward with unshaken pace. There was no loud noise, no machine roaring through the trees, just the simple rhythm of boots pressing earth, the steady rise and fall of breath. The figure carried no immediate threat that could be seen, no growl, no roar, no flash of claws. And yet the predators knew. Their instincts screamed at them, not in the way prey screamed fear, but in the way danger announces itself before a storm. Every creature has a way of measuring risk. For predators, it is the tilt of shoulders, the firmness of steps, the eyes that never lower. They tested the figure with stares, waiting for weakness, waiting for the usual signs that they could dominate. But instead of weakness, they found calm. The calm was steady, stronger than noise, stronger even than teeth or claw. The silence of the forest began to feel different. It was no longer only the silence of warning, but the silence of respect. The ridge seemed to breathe slower, the trees holding still as if unwilling to interrupt. For the first time, the cubs' growls died entirely, replaced by wide-eyed curiosity. They could not understand why their instincts held them back, but they obeyed them anyway. The human stopped at a clearing, sunlight cutting through the trees to rest on the ground ahead. No movement came from the predators. The forest waited. It was not a moment of battle, but of recognition. Something ancient stirred in the hearts of those who watched, an understanding that presence alone could shape the world around it. The observers on the ridge scribbled notes with quick hands, but words felt too small for what they were seeing. They whispered to each other, wondering how such silence could hold so much power. It was not a silence of emptiness, but of weight. A silence that filled the space between breaths and carried meaning heavier than sound. For those who lived in the forest, it was a lesson in instinct. For those who watched from afar, it was a lesson in power. The cubs lowered themselves against the earth, pressing their bodies flat as if the soil itself offered shelter. Their elders stood behind them, not defeated, but cautious. Their sharp eyes locked on the human who stood so still, so unshaken. The day stretched, and yet no roar came, no clash of teeth or claws. The predators held their silence, and the forest remained wrapped in its strange calm. The human turned slightly, scanning the ridge and the shadows, not with fear, but with patience. That patience was its own kind of weapon, one the beasts could not fight against. As the sun dipped lower, the ridge glowed in the fading light, and the silence remained unbroken. For the first time in memory, the forest felt united, not by sound or struggle, but by the presence of something it could not name, something it could not challenge. The cubs curled against the earth, their play forgotten, their growls gone. The elders stayed rooted, their eyes watchful, their pride humbled by something beyond their reach. And so, the silent forest became a story of its own. Those who saw, it carried the weight of that moment long after they left. The ridge, once a place of roars and clashes, became remembered as the place where even predators bowed to silence. The forest itself, in its strange quiet, bore witness to the arrival of something it could not resist, the steady, patient strength of a human presence. The forest had not yet released its breath. It remained heavy with silence, as though it wanted to test the limits of how quiet it could truly become. Even the smallest creatures did not dare to stir, and every leaf seemed fixed in place, waiting. From far away, the ridge appeared lifeless, but those who watched closely knew that countless eyes hid in the shadows. They were wide, alert, and locked onto a single figure making its way through the trees. The human arrived without ceremony. There was no thunder of machines, no blaze of weapons, no dramatic entrance to demand attention. Only the steady rhythm of boots pressing against soil, the whisper of fabric brushing against branches, and the calm breath of someone who had walked long and far. It was an arrival that did not ask permission, yet did not challenge directly, either. The figure moved as though it belonged here, though every creature watching knew it was something alien to their world. The cubs, who had been restless before, crouched lower. Their tiny ears twitched, noses lifting faintly to catch the strange scent. They wanted to snarl, to bare teeth as their instincts commanded, but the sound stuck in their throats. Their elders, larger, stronger, and far more experienced, watched with the kind of caution that predators rarely showed. They had faced storms, rival packs, even death itself, but this arrival struck something deeper, something older in their instincts. The human paused at a patch of open ground, where sunlight spilled through a gap in the tall trees. It was not a grand stance, nor one meant to intimidate, but it carried weight nonetheless. The way the figure held itself, balanced, steady, alert without appearing tense, told the forest everything it needed to know. This was not prey. This was not even a rival predator. This was something different, something the forest had never measured before. From a higher point along the ridge, distant observers leaned into their scopes. Their breath fogged faintly on the glass, their notes scribbled quickly, though words still felt clumsy for what they were seeing. "He doesn't need to do anything," one whispered softly. "Just being there, it's enough." They were right. The silence did not weaken as the human moved further into the forest. It deepened. Predators usually controlled the silence. They could hush a woodland with a single roar, scattering birds and small creatures alike. But this silence was not born of fear nor of dominance. It came from stillness, from presence itself. The forest seemed to sense it and respond. Even the wind moved gently, as though unwilling to disturb the moment. The cubs crept forward a few steps, curiosity battling their instincts. Their paws pressed lightly on the soil, testing the edge of bravery. But the moment their small eyes met the human's gaze, they froze. Those eyes were not wild like theirs, not glowing with animal hunger, but calm and calculating. Calmness, they realized, could feel far more dangerous than rage. They lowered themselves again, uncertain of why they obeyed without command. The elders held their ground, but their muscles tensed beneath their fur. They did not leap. They did not roar. Instead, they studied the human the way a seasoned fighter studies an unknown opponent, looking for weakness, testing the air for signals. But the signals they found were confusing. The human carried strength without shouting it. He moved with confidence, yet no arrogance. And most of all, he stood unshaken in the very heart of their domain, as though the forest itself had allowed him passage. Observers far above whispered theories. Some said the silence was unnatural, a trick of technology. Others said it was instinct, that all living things recognized a force when it entered their world. Still others suggested it was something in between, a kind of presence that humans carried, invisible yet undeniable. The debate mattered little to the predators who watched. They did not deal in theories. They dealt in instincts, and their instincts told them not to act. The human continued forward, scanning the ridge and tree line with patient eyes. He was not hunting for food. He was not challenging for territory. His steps were measured, purposeful, as though each stride was part of something larger, something the forest itself did not yet understand. The cubs whimpered softly, but their voices were small, almost swallowed by the stillness. The elders silenced them with a low glance, not daring to break the quiet more than necessary. The air around the ridge grew heavier as the day stretched on. Shadows lengthened, curling like fingers around the rocks and branches. Sunlight turned golden, spilling across the clearing where the human had paused. He stood like a figure carved from stone, neither rushing nor hesitating, his breath steady and unshaken. The predators began to understand something they had never known. Silence could be a kind of power. It could bend even the strongest will. For the forest, this moment was strange but unforgettable. For the watchers far away, it was proof of something they had long suspected, that humanity carried a presence unlike any other. Where machines and weapons created noise, destruction, and fear, this lone figure created silence, and in that silence, the predators hesitated. The cubs did not play. The elders did not roar. Even the ridge itself seemed to hold its voice. Time passed slowly, as if the very hours were caught in the weight of this arrival. Nothing struck, nothing screamed, and yet everything changed. The predators began to shift uneasily, not because they were trapped, but because they were unsure. They could fight rivals, they could chase prey, but how could they respond to something that carried stillness as a weapon? The human adjusted the strap across his shoulder, the motion simple, almost unimportant, yet every predator flinched at once. The slightest movement sent ripples through their instincts, reminding them that strength was not always loud, nor did it need to be shown in flashes of teeth or claws. Sometimes it was the ability to stand calm when surrounded by danger. The ridge, once a place of defiance and noise, became something else that day. It became a stage for a lesson none of the forest's inhabitants had expected. The human had not needed to fight, nor shout, nor threaten. His arrival alone had changed the rules of the land. As dusk settled and the sky turned a deep shade of violet, the human finally moved again. He stepped further into the forest, his form slowly swallowed by shadows. The silence did not vanish immediately. It lingered, stretching across the trees like an invisible cloak, leaving the predators rooted to their places. The cubs huddled closer to their elders. The elders kept their heads high, their pride wounded, but their caution intact. The observers scribbled faster, their notes spilling over the page. They knew they had witnessed something rare, something worth carrying back beyond the ridge. Humanity, they thought, had shown not what it could destroy, but what it could command without lifting a weapon. The forest breathed again only after the human had gone. Birds cautiously returned to their branches. Insects hummed softly, testing the air. The predators exhaled, their growls returning in uncertain tones. But the lesson remained clear. The arrival had left a mark, not in blood or broken stone, but in silence. And silence, they realized, could be the loudest message of all. The ridge remained quiet, but the silence was no longer simple. It had weight now, like a stone pressing down on the chest of every creature that lived there. The human's arrival had unsettled the natural order. The predators, who had always ruled the forest with growls, sharp teeth, and sudden strikes, now found themselves held back by something they could not explain. Their cubs had lowered their heads without being told, and even the elders had hesitated. But hesitation was not in their nature. Predators, after all, are not meant to accept mysteries. They test, they push, they challenge. To do nothing was to admit weakness, and weakness in their world was an invitation to be replaced. So as the sun dipped lower, painting the ridge with the fading glow of gold and red, a decision formed among them. They would test the human. They would find out what kind of creature could bring such silence to a land where even storms bowed before their roars. The cubs sensed it first. Their restless movements returned, paws tapping the ground softly, ears flicking as though they could already feel the weight of the coming trial. Their elders kept their eyes on the human, who still moved with steady steps along the ridge, pausing, only to look across the trees as though measuring the distance of every shadow. He gave no sign of concern, no flinch at the watching eyes that burned from the darkness. That calmness itself felt like a challenge. The first test was small, almost hidden. A young predator, not quite grown but stronger than the cubs, stepped forward from the shadows. It moved low, body close to the ground, eyes locked on the human's back. Its steps were careful, meant to test the air, to test the silence. It let out a low growl, barely above a whisper, just to see if it could crack the stillness. But the growl faded into the trees without effect. The human did not stop. He did not turn his head. He simply adjusted his pace slightly, as though he had already sensed the movement before it began. The predator froze, caught in confusion. How could this creature know? The human gave no glance, no threat, and yet the test had failed before it had even begun. The predator lowered its head, retreating slowly to the shadows again. The elders exchanged glances. This was not enough. They could not let the lesson end with one failed attempt. The silence itself was an insult to them, a reminder that they had been bent without a fight. If the cubs learned to bow so easily, their line would weaken. The predators had survived because they tested everything, from storms to prey to rivals. Now, They would test this human. The second test came with more weight. From higher along the ridge, one of the older predators circled down, its paws striking the earth with deliberate force. Each step echoed, meant to reclaim the sound that the human had stolen. It did not hide, did not creep. It walked openly, its form lit by the last rays of the sun. Its growl grew louder as it approached, a challenge not just to the human, but to the forest itself, demanding it return to the order it had always known. The human stopped this time. He did not turn quickly, but slowly, with purpose. His head lifted, eyes calm but unshaken, as though he had been expecting the predator all along. He made no sound, but the silence seemed to thicken around him again. The predator, massive and scarred from old battles, stopped its steps for just a moment. That pause, small as it was, meant something. The human shifted the strap across his shoulder, adjusting his weight slightly. To the distant observers who watched through scopes, it looked like nothing more than a man carrying his gear. But to the predator, that small movement was sharp as lightning. Its ears twitched, its growl faltered. It felt, for the first time in its long life, that it was the one being measured. The predator let out a thunderous roar to break the spell. Birds scattered from the trees, the cubs trembled at the sound, the forest shook, but the human did not move. He simply stood there, steady, unbroken, his eyes never leaving the predator's face. And when the echo of the roar faded, silence returned even heavier than before. The predator's test had failed. From their hidden vantage point, the observers whispered quickly, their voices full of awe. "He doesn't fight them. He doesn't need to. He lets them test themselves and fail." They scribbled notes furiously, knowing this was more than a moment in the forest. It was proof of something larger. The predators, however, were not finished. They knew instinctively that if they allowed this silence to hold, it would spread like fire. The forest itself would learn to bow to it. So they prepared the final test. Not one predator, not two, but several moved together. From different directions, they advanced slowly, circling the human like shadows closing in on a flame. Their bodies shifted in rhythm, their eyes glowing faintly as the last light of the day bled into darkness. The cubs whimpered, sensing the danger. The elders kept them close, their own eyes locked on the ridge. This was not a simple test now. It was a measure of survival itself. Either the predators would reclaim their power, or the silence would become their new master. The human did not run. He did not even change his posture. He stood where he was, his hand resting calmly against his side, eyes moving slowly from one predator to the next as they closed in. The silence was complete now, so deep that even the observers found themselves holding their breath. And then, nothing. The predators stopped just short, their bodies tense, their claws digging faintly into the ground. They wanted to strike. Their muscles screamed for it. But something unseen held them back. The human's stillness, his calmness, was heavier than any roar they had ever faced. It was not force. It was not threat. It was presence. One by one, the predators lowered their heads, not in submission, not in defeat, but in recognition. The human had passed their test, though he had never lifted a hand, never shown his teeth, never spoken a word. He had taught them that silence itself could be strength, and that sometimes the greatest weapon was not action, but control. The cubs watched carefully. Their young eyes, wide and full of wonder, took in the moment. They had expected to see claws and blood, but instead they saw restraint. They saw that power did not always need to be loud. For them, this lesson would carry forward, shaping their instincts long after the human had left. The ridge, once a place of growls and defiance, now felt different. The silence remained, but it was no longer heavy. It was balanced. The forest had found a new rhythm, one where predators and prey alike moved with the memory of this test. As night finally wrapped its cloak around the trees, the human turned and continued his path. His footsteps faded into the darkness, leaving behind a lesson none had expected. The predators had tested him, but it was they who had been changed. The observers leaned back, their notes complete, their thoughts racing. Humanity had once again shown that its true strength did not always come from force, but from the way it could shape the world simply by being present. And so the forest remained silent, but not out of fear, out of respect, out of recognition, out of something deeper, something unseen, but felt by all who lived there. The night had settled deep across the forest, and the ridge stood wrapped in shadows. The air was cool, carrying the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves. The predators had withdrawn after their test, but the silence they had left behind did not fade. It lingered, heavy and watchful, like a presence that refused to leave. The human moved quietly, step by step, his figure a small but steady shape against the dark trees. He had not fought them. He had not spoken. Yet the ridge itself seemed to bend to his rhythm. But silence cannot last forever. A turning point always comes, a moment when balance tips and a choice must be made. For the predators, the lesson of restraint was still fresh, but their world was built on survival, and survival demanded proof. For the human, his strength had been in his calm, but calm alone could not last if challenged again. Both sides were waiting, watching, holding on to the weight of that silence. The forest knew something had to break. The turning point began small. The cubs, restless from the long stillness, began to stir. Their soft growls, almost playful, carried across the trees. The elders hushed them with sharp glances, but the sound was enough. The forest seemed to breathe again, as though waiting for the next step. The predators could not remain in hesitation forever. They had tested the human and found him strong in ways they could not explain, but instinct pushed them. If strength could not be measured by claws or teeth, then how could they trust it? The human understood this, though no words passed his lips. His eyes scanned the trees, watching not with fear, but with awareness. He knew the ridge was a place of decision, and decisions demanded action. He slowed his steps, placing himself where the moonlight cut through the branches, as if to make himself visible, as if to say, "Here I am." The predators answered. From the shadows, a new movement stirred. Not the cubs, not the cautious elders, but the strongest of their kind. They stepped forward, shoulders broad, their eyes glowing faint in the night. They did not hide this time. They did not test with half measures. Their growls rumbled low and steady, not of rage but of challenge, the kind that marked the border between respect and defiance. The observers who watched from afar tensed, their voices hushed. They had seen the silence, the failed tests, the strange calm. But now they whispered, "This is it. This is the moment." Pens scribbled against notepads. Hands tightened on equipment. They knew what the predators were asking now, not just if the human could stand, but if he could lead. The standoff stretched long. The predators circled again, but slower this time, their movements measured. The human turned slightly to face them, his body balanced, his breathing calm. He had no weapon in his hands, only the steady presence that had carried him this far. And then, for the first time, he made a choice. He knelt. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself until one knee touched the ground. His hand brushed the dirt, lifting a handful of earth. He let it fall through his fingers, the grains scattering softly in the moonlight. It was a simple act, yet it carried meaning. The predators stilled, their growls fading into silence. What did it mean? Was it surrender? Was it challenge? No one could answer, but the weight of it pressed into every creature watching. One of the predators stepped closer, its head lowered, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the ground where the earth had fallen. The human did not move. His stillness was no longer only control, it was trust. He trusted that his silence, his calm, his choice not to fight was enough. The predator paused, then lowered itself slightly, bowing its head closer to the earth. The watchers in the trees held their breath. The moment stretched thin, ready to break, and then it shifted. The predator did not strike. It did not roar. It stepped back. Slowly, the others followed. One by one, they lowered their heads, not in fear, but in recognition. This was the turning point. The predators had tested him, and he had given them not force, not fear, but understanding. He had shown them that strength was not only in what one could destroy, but in what one could hold steady, even when surrounded. And in that moment, the ridge itself seemed to change. The silence was no longer heavy. It was shared. It was alive. The cubs, still watching wide-eyed, stepped closer too. One of them padded forward cautiously, its small paws leaving soft marks in the dirt. It stopped a short distance from the human, head tilted, eyes curious. The human extended his hand slowly, palm open, not to command, but to offer. The cub did not touch him, but it did not retreat either. That small closeness was enough to mark the shift. The lesson had passed from the elders to the young. The observers whispered again, excitement in their voices now. "This is history," one of them said. "Not a fight, a meeting, a bridge." They understood the importance of what had just happened. It was not only about predators and one human. It was about what humanity brought wherever it went. The ability to stand not just with weapons, but with presence, with calm, with something unseen yet deeply felt. The predators withdrew into the forest at last, their movements slow and deliberate. They left the ridge without sound, but not without meaning. They had accepted the human's strength, not as dominance, but as part of their world. The cubs followed their elders, still glancing back, as though holding on to the image of that kneeling figure who had taught them that silence could be more powerful than a roar. The ridge was quiet again, but it was no longer the same quiet. It was balanced, shaped by what had passed. The human stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and looked across the forest one last time before moving forward. His steps were steady, his path unchanged, but the ridge carried his mark now, invisible, yet unshakable. This was the turning point, not the end of a struggle, but the beginning of a new rhythm. The predators would remember. The cubs would grow with the memory. The observers would carry the story back to their world, and the human, silent and steady, would continue forward, leaving behind a lesson that could not be measured by claws, teeth, or weapons. The night closed in around him, but the silence that followed was not fear. It was respect, trust, and the first hint of something greater than either side had expected. The ridge no longer looked the same as it once had. Days had passed, yet the memory of that night still lingered in the forest air, as if the trees themselves had taken part in what had happened. The predators had withdrawn into their shadowed paths, and the human had moved on, his steady steps carrying him far from the ridge. But the silence he left behind was not forgotten. It had become something more, an echo. A lesson that was remembered in ways no roar or battle could ever leave. The cubs were the first to carry it forward. They had been young, restless, full of instinct and playfulness that often blurred into recklessness. That night, they had seen a human stand unshaken among their strongest, not with claws, not with growls, not with force, but with calm. It was not something they understood immediately, but the image remained, sinking deeper into their growing minds. As they followed their elders through the forest in the nights that came after, they would stop sometimes, sniffing the earth, watching. The moonlight touched the ground in the same way it had touched the human's still form. The elders, too, carried the weight of it. They had lived long enough to know strength in many forms, fangs, speed, and cunning. But this was something new. The human had not tried to dominate them, nor had he shown fear. He had chosen silence and trust, and in that choice, he had revealed a different kind of strength. To the predators, this became a reminder that survival was not only about what could be taken, but also about what could be respected. For the human, the ridge became part of his journey, though he did not look back. He knew that leaving the place, unchanged, was impossible. He had left something behind, invisible yet powerful. It was not victory, not defeat, but a mark of understanding. He continued on his path, steady and focused, but perhaps with a quiet knowledge that the world had shifted, even if only slightly, because of what had happened there. The observers who had watched from the shadows did not forget either. They had come expecting conflict, a clash of human strength against the wild predators. But what they had seen was far more than that. They returned to their people with words that struggled to capture the truth. But one phrase repeated itself again. And again, the silence spoke louder than weapons. It was a story that spread, carried from voice to voice, until even those who had never seen the ridge could imagine it clearly. The stillness of the human, the lowering of the predators' heads, the cub stepping closer with curiosity rather than fear. The story grew, not as a tale of survival, but as a lesson. In villages, in outposts, in places where humans looked at the stars or walked through forests of their own, they repeated it. Parents told it to children, teachers told it to learners, and travelers carried it as something worth sharing by firelight. It became a reminder that humanity was not only about invention or war or endurance, it was also about the strength to remain calm, the courage to trust, and the wisdom to see that silence could build bridges where noise could only break them. The predators themselves passed the lesson on in their way. When the cubs grew, they would not remember every detail of that night, but they would carry the instinct shaped by it. They would be more cautious before leaping, more curious before attacking, more willing to pause when facing something unknown. That pause, born from the memory of the human's stillness, would shape their choices, shaping even the balance of their hunting and their survival. It was not surrender, not weakness, but a new rhythm woven into their instincts. The forest, too, seemed to remember. The ridge no longer felt like just another high ground above the trees. Birds landed there with unusual calm. The air seemed clearer, as though the silence had left a mark on the very earth. Travelers who passed through felt a strange sense of weight and peace, though they could not always explain it. Some said the ridge hummed with a quiet energy, as though the ground itself held onto the memory of what had happened. And so the lesson endured, not as a rule written in stone, but as a story shared in many ways. Some spoke of it with awe, saying it was proof of humanity's special place in the universe. Others whispered of it with respect, saying it showed that even predators could bow their heads when faced with a different kind of strength. For the predators, it lived in their instincts. For the humans, it lived in their stories. For the forest, it lived in the silence that seemed richer than before. In time, the ridge would see other nights, other hunters, other travelers. But the memory of that moment, the human kneeling, the earth falling softly from his hand, the predators stepping back, would remain like an unseen mark carved into the air. It reminded all who remembered that strength was not always about force, and that survival did not always belong to the loudest or the fiercest. Sometimes survival, and even respect, belonged to the one who could hold still, who could wait, who could trust. The cubs grew older, carrying the memory into their adulthood. When they became hunters, leading their own paths through the forest, they carried a strange caution in their hearts. They taught their own young not only how to fight, but also when not to. The ridge remained part of their territory, but it was never approached without quiet steps, as though the place itself demanded respect. The humans people, too, carried the tale into their records. Some told it as fact, others as myth, but all agreed it carried truth. Leaders listened to it when deciding how to face challenges, soldiers heard it before they marched, and wanderers carried it as a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories left no scars, only silence. Generations later, when the forest had changed and the ridge had weathered many seasons, the story was still remembered. It was no longer only about one man or one night. It had become a lesson for both sides, predator and human alike. It reminded them that even in the darkest of nights, even when instincts demanded conflict, there was another way, a way that did not weaken, but strengthened, a way that did not divide, but connected. And so the ridge lived on, not just as a place on a map, but as a symbol. The predators still passed quietly beneath its trees, the humans still spoke of it with respect, and the forest still held its silence like a treasure. The lesson was remembered, not because it was shouted, but because it was carried gently, shared in whispers, and lived in actions. The ridge had once been quiet until the silence was broken by something more powerful than sound. And that silence, once spoken, was never forgotten.